Welcome to Avenue M. My name is Joey Taylor.
And I am Haroon Mogul.
We're two men on a journey of faith and meaning. In each episode, we sit down with a remarkable guest to unpack the moments that shape us, the struggles that build us, and the questions that intrigue us. This week's guest is Zaakir Tameez. His new book, Charles Sumner, Conscious of a Nation, bridges personal identity and American history. We talk about why a young Muslim guy chose to tell the story of a 19th century abolitionist, and he shows how neglected narratives of Reconstruction and civil rights can inspire us today. Woven throughout our conversation are themes of faith, courage, solidarity, and the shared responsibility of all Americans to claim, tell, and act upon their history. Can you tell us a little bit about who this Charles Sumner guy is? Introduce us to the thesis of the book, and tell us why someone who's not American should care about this book that you've written.
Well, thank you, Joey and Haroon, for having me on this show. Let me tell you how this book project came about. Why me, as a young immigrant of color, chose to write about this 19th century dead white man. I went to law school at Yale, and like many young law students, I had always been inspired by the generation of civil rights heroes like Thurgood Marshall and the other figures of the NAACP who helped to secure the integration of public schools in the seminal case Brown versus Board, which we all learn about in school. I read the brief that the NAACP filed in Brown. And in that brief, I stumble on Charles Sumner, because Thurgood Marshall cites Charles Sumner by name, not once, not twice, but more than 40 times. And I am shocked by this. I learned about Charles Sumner. He's most famous as a U.S. senator during the Civil War who was almost caned to death while speaking out against slavery. What I did not know is that Sumner is not only an abolitionist, but a champion of equal rights, who in 1849, more than 100 years before Brown versus Board, collaborates on the first interracial legal team in American history with a young black lawyer who's 26, my age, and together they tried to integrate the schools of Boston in a case at the Massachusetts Supreme Court. They're not successful, but the arguments that Sumner and his colleague Robert Morris put together, point by point, were used by the NAACP more than 100 years later. And I felt like that story is so central to American legal history and the story globally of human rights, and particularly of school integration, that has been neglected and that needed to be told again. And that's kind of where this book project emerged.
So then you've got a really interesting the way you're connecting this between America and the wider world, right? I still think within the context of America, do you find that when people find out about the book and find out who you are, that it strikes them as unexpected, shall we say, right? Like who gets to tell American history? Is it someone like you or me? Or are we just, do you see what I'm saying there?
I've thought about this question myself. And I'll tell you when I first asked this question of who gets to tell American history. I went to the University of Virginia, and before the start of my third year, in August 2017, this is in Charlottesville, neo-Nazis and neo-Confederates stormed our campus, desecrated our lawn, carried tiki torches, and shouted white supremacist, bigoted, anti-Semitic remarks. You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. Blood and soil. All these extremely disgusting expressions of hatred. And there was this one moment where the neo-Nazis marched towards the Thomas Jefferson statue. Jefferson being, of course, the third president of the US, but also the founder of UVA. Before they arrived at the Jefferson statue, a group of my classmates got there first and circled the Jefferson statue as if to defend it. And when the white supremacists came, they surrounded the Jefferson statue and started to do this very bizarre ritual of venerating Thomas Jefferson. But they couldn't get to the statue itself because the students had already defended it. What's striking about this story is that Jefferson, as we know, is a complicated figure. He wrote the words, "All men are created equal," in the Declaration of Independence. He was also a slaveholder. The white supremacists wanted to venerate Jefferson as a slaveholder and claim Jefferson as one of theirs. The students, I don't think, were trying to venerate Jefferson, but they were trying to defend Jefferson and claim their right to tell Jefferson's story and to be guardians of that history. And ever since, I've been reflecting on, if we don't tell American history, who will? Because neo-Confederates, for example, talk about American history all the time. They go to gatherings of the sons and daughters of Confederacy. They do military reenactments. They're steeped in an extremely cleansed, disturbing version of American history, but they claim it as theirs. And I think we have to respond by telling a very different version of American history, an inclusive story of American history, and a story that isn't just full of despair, but also a story that inspires. And I think that's what we have to do if we're going to retain our American identity and celebrate our past, but also learn from our past to make the world better.
So I'm sure you've gotten some strange reactions from people when they hear that you, Muslim American, has written a book on Charles Sumner. Have there been any funny or ridiculous reactions that you've got as you've introduced your own identity in the context of this book?
Really, I think a lot of people are just like, why? And I get that question a lot. Why? Why are you writing this story? And I think a lot of people have this mental image of what an American historian, especially an American historian who writes these in the genre of great American biography, and they have a mental image of what that person looks like. And it's an old white professor in a suit or something like that. I think we have to move away from that mental image. And one way to do that is to have new storytellers telling our past. We saw this in Hamilton, right? Where you've got Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's an immigrant himself or comes from an immigrant background, who is embracing American history and telling it fresh, putting a little twist on it, which is really important because American history is for all of us. It's not just for a certain class or a certain type of person.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I think it's funny. I had a friend who she did her PhD in American history. I think she studied 18th century American history, and as soon as she got her tenure track job, she was asked by someone at the university if she could teach a course on the Middle East. And she was kind of like, well, I don't know if like, I don't know if you know how academia works, or I guess it's supposed to work, right? But like, actually, other than point of ancestry and some cultural familiarity with food and things like that, I have no actual ability to teach a class on the modern Middle East just because I'm ancestrally Middle Eastern. But I think you raise a really interesting question or set of questions about who belongs to a community. And I think in that sense, it does speak to being American. And I think it also speaks to belonging to a faith community. So, the three of us belong to aspirationally universal faith traditions where lots of different types of people can claim a stake in a story, right? So, Joey, presumably you're not ancestrally Semitic. I mean, neither am I, right? My family's originally from Punjab in South Asia, but nevertheless, I feel a sense of, I wouldn't say ownership in, but participation in a story that doesn't include me. And so I'm wondering on that note, you're talking about UVA, you're talking about writing a biography. That's all much farther down the road, right? Because obviously you don't just wake up one day and write a biography of a great American. Was there a particular moment that you can point to in your life growing up where you felt part of the American story? You felt like that American story was something that you had an ability to contribute to?
Let me give you two moments. The first moment, both at UVA and then at law school at Yale, was when I learned. So, for example, at UVA, the Thomas Jefferson statue I just referred to, Jefferson's holding a book in the statue that has the names of God in different languages. Because Jefferson, in principle, believed that America should one day be a multi-religious, multi-ethnic democracy. And in that book, he has the name of Allah, which is how Muslims refer to the one true God. And then connected to that moment, when I'm in law school at Yale, is when I discover that in the front entrance to Sterling Library, the main library on Yale's campus, at the very front facade, they have different religious texts, including a passage from the Quran, that you enter and is carved into the stone from when the library was first built. That's moment number one, where I felt included in the American narrative. Moment number two is my own realization at UVA that this is a school designed by Thomas Jefferson, but assembled by enslaved people who had no choice in the matter, who were brutalized and oppressed. And my own discovery that somewhere between 20 to 40% of enslaved people came from a Muslim background. And you can actually look at the names of enslaved people at Monticello, Jefferson's plantation, and see the names of or Muslim-sounding names, so to speak, on the archival record. And what is so striking, and then we can even go further back, that when Christopher Columbus arrived, he had brought a translator with him. And remember, he thought he was going to India or somewhere in that part of the world. And the first language the translator attempted to use to communicate with indigenous people was Arabic. So the first words uttered by European colonizers in the Americas was Arabic, the language of the Quran. So from both perspectives, Islam and Muslims have always been here, both conceptually through Jefferson and others who envisioned a multi-religious democracy, but also in the physical oppression and the labor of enslaved people, many of whom were Muslim themselves. So Islam and Muslims have always been here, so to speak, at least since the arrival of Europeans, and we've always been part of this story.
Do we know the literal first words spoken by that translator?
I don't. I don't. I'm sure it was probably like "hello." How are you?
Yeah, I've
Mark
heard.
about it.
I mean, I don't know if there's
I don't know.
Sorry. I don't know if there's actually if it's corroborated by I had a colleague who was an academic who thought that it was salam, like salamu alaikum, right? That presumably if you're greeting someone and trying to establish your bona fides, you'd say salam. Now, I don't know how you would know that, right? That was just conjecture.
Well, this is a great answer to the icebreaker question. If you had a time machine, which moment in history would you go back to? So now I know that I would go back to that moment, so I could tell you, Joey, what he said.
Yeah, that would be an amazing thing to know. I'm struck by the first moment you mentioned that you felt kind of brought into this American narrative wasn't until university. It was later on in your life. I'm wondering, is there I have a similar question about your Muslim identity. Is there a moment in your life when you realized that you were Muslim? A moment that you realized that you were distinct from maybe the rest of the community around you, or a moment when you sort of like had a cognitive choice of this is who I want to be in the world?
I remember my parents had me going to a small Islamic school for my first few years, and I moved to public school in fourth grade. And I remember starting in August, and in September 10th, my mom sits me down and tells me, be very careful tomorrow being the anniversary of September 11th. And she's explaining to me, she's trying to give me, and I'm like 9 years old, a whole rundown on Islamophobia, on 9/11, on what might happen, what might people say to me, because I had no exposure to it growing up, because I was in my own religious community for the most part. And I remember going to school the next day, standing a little bit taller for the Pledge of Allegiance, uh, kind of looking over my shoulder, and nothing happened. I don't have a story for you from that day, but maybe the absence of the story is telling as well, because I think there is both a very genuine experience of racism, bigotry, and Islamophobia that all of us from our community have gone through in school, but there's also the story of our own um, insecurity about being American and our own hesitation to be patriotic or to be over patriotic because we fear being threatened. And a lot of that is real, but a lot of that is also self-imposed in a way where we feel this internal sense of insecurity about our Americanness that I think we have to learn to let go of.
So your the story I mean also brings to mind you're a lot younger than we are. And I think people of my generation and probably people of all generations at a certain point always talk about what is lacking or what is missing or what younger folks need and things like that. And Joey and I, when we were talking about your book and you and what you've done, we thought to ourselves that maybe we turn that around and ask you questions about maybe what got you to the point where you would have the level of confidence that you would want to undertake writing a book, and even to separate that from the identity question, right? Like, let's say you had written a biography of a great, I don't know, 18th century Canadian figure, right? And it doesn't necessarily intersect with politics, nationalism in a very personal sense, right? Just to undertake to write something is a significant achievement. You've mentioned some great universities. I'm sure you've made a lot of aunties jealous. We won't go there, but you know what I'm saying, right? Like there's this narrative that a lot of South Asian Americans get. Academic achievement, but often directed in a certain towards a certain outcome, right? Certain career things like that. I'm wondering if there's things you feel like you got along the way or didn't get that brought you to where you are now.
Well, you mentioned aunties. Let me tell you about my grandmother, my nanima. Her dream was always to study English literature. She loved reading growing up in India. She went to a British school and she grew up. You can imagine this, a young Indian girl reading Charlotte Bronte and Jane Austen and Wuthering Heights. And this was her passion. This was her first interest. And her dream was always to be an academic and teach English literature. But she never was able to fulfill that dream. She had come to America as an immigrant. My grandfather passed away when my mom was 8 years old, and my grandmother becomes a single mom with three kids, who simply was not able to go back to school because she had to raise three children on her own. But she raised me with a love of reading and a love of writing. She would show me her letters from that time period as she's in America writing back home, and she's a collector, so she always keeps all her like things. And so she showed me all these trinkets. She showed me all this historical, not artifacts, but I mean, she has spoons from her mother. So you can imagine like me just like looking at these like early 20th century silver spoons and just having this passion for history and this interest in books. Going to school, I always loved showing my grandmother my writing. I would write an essay. I would write a short story in like sixth grade, and it's like 3 pages long and has all these typos, whatever it might be. But I would show them to her, and she enjoyed and loved reading what I wrote. She'd hang on to all my papers. So even now, if I want to know what was I doing in ninth grade, I would go to my grandmother's house because chances are whatever homework assignments I had, she's got in her possession. Now, fast forward, I go to college and then in law school, and I'm still writing papers. But now it's not 2 or 3 pages. Now it's 20 pages, 30 pages. And now it's not a fun short story. Now it's some dense, dry, heavily footnoted academic piece of writing or wannabe academic piece of writing. And I stopped being able to enjoy or to share my passion with her because I'm writing something that is so obscure and so difficult to comprehend and something just so boring. Until I got to this project. And what was so exciting about this project, it started as a paper for a class with the goal of writing a law review article. but I kept trying to turn it into a storytelling. And storytelling is not the sort of genre that law reviews are looking to publish, but it's exactly the genre that my grandmother enjoyed. And it was the first time in many years that I could give my nanny something that I had written that she actually really liked reading. And it was probably with her encouragement and with others that the paper started turning into a book project, and particularly into a nonfiction public book project for ordinary people to read, not just scholars.
That's a beautiful story. How did she respond as she read this book?
She's been really enjoying it. So she was the first person I showed a chapter to because she was kind of my test subject. And even I remember when I first met publishers, and you can imagine the scene. I'm this like young kid wearing a jacket for like the second time in my life. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but
Yeah, but
I'm
it's salmon though, so it looks good on you, right? So you're at least looking good.
maybe now. This is when this is a few years ago, and I'm going up the skyrise in New York City, up the elevator. I'm meeting a publisher for the first time, and we sit down, and one of the first questions my publisher asked me was, how do you know you're going to write something that people will actually want to read? And how do you know you can pull that off? And I said, my work needs to pass the grandmother test. If my grandmother enjoys it, then I think a lot of people enjoy it. And if she's unhappy with what I'm writing, because she's brutally honest, she would tell me if it's crappy writing or not interesting. And so that was kind of, my grandma was my test subject. And throughout the whole editing process, my editor would come back to me and ask, does this chapter meet the grandma test? Does this chapter meet the grandma test?
That's amazing. I'm hearing a little bit of a theme here, and I got a big earnest question for you. So feel free to do with it what you want, okay? Um, but I'm thinking of this moment where your friends are surrounding this monument, right? I'm thinking of you writing this book on Charles Sumner, us having this conversation about who gets to tell the American story. And the thing that's occurring to me is this definition of community that both Roberto Unger and Michael Lind have. And they say that a community is a group of people who are committed to shared descendants. And I'm wondering, what do you think when so much of our obsession right now is what do we do with this problematic past? What do you think is implicit for you in the vision for the descendants that we will share together?
Hmm. Let me take you back to our ancestors first and then connect it to the descendants. So we often talk about in American history, particularly in schools, we're always focused on the American Revolution, the founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, and this is what we still teach in school, particularly when it comes to the Constitution. We don't talk about the Civil War in similar light. If we do talk about the Civil War in school, the way I learned it, as most people do, it's a national tragedy. It's a blemish in our past. A lot of people died. All that is true. But we rarely talk about what happened in the period right after the Civil War during Reconstruction. And you're going to see in a second why this is relevant to your question. In Reconstruction, Charles Sumner is a US Senator, and he is pushing for what becomes the first Reconstruction Act, which was a law that required Southern states, former Confederate states, to hold new constitutional conventions that are open to African Americans to write new constitutions. And this is an amazing moment. In 1861, there were more than 4 million enslaved people in this country. By 1871, there is zero. And more than that, formerly enslaved people are now writing state constitutions, participating in constitutional conventions. These conventions helped to draft constitutions that, one, allowed all men to vote, that, two, often granted women property rights for the first time in the Confederacy, that, three, abolished debtors' prisons, and that 4 established public schools. I grew up in Texas, where the Texas Constitution guarantees every child a right to an adequate education. And do you know who wrote that? Formerly enslaved people in collaboration with white people in Texas in the 1870s during Reconstruction are envisioning public schools. They're envisioning multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy. They're envisioning a world in which men and women can own property. It's this radical egalitarian revolution. In the same way we had a first American Revolution, we're having a second American Revolution during the Reconstruction period, and we're still governed by many of the documents that were written at that moment. And I think it's a tragedy that we ignore that legacy. We talk about the founding fathers. We don't talk about the second generation of founding fathers, black and white, who helped to create public schools, land-grant universities, women's rights, etc. And what they envisioned was a country in which people like me and Harun and other so-called immigrant Americans, as opposed to heritage Americans or however people want to define that, they envisioned a world in which we were all part of this country and our descendants will be part of this country. And so here we are today, and we're thinking about what America will look like now, what it's going to look like in the future, what our country, where is it headed? And there are a lot of uncertainties related to that, but we're in many ways governed by the documents that formerly enslaved people wrote, particularly in the South. We don't talk about that at all, but we ought to talk about that because I think that provides us many lessons and provides us a deeper sense of what it means to be American now and in the future.
I didn't know a lot of that. It's quite incredible. But it does raise something to me that I think I kind of wonder about or worry about, which is that, in our nation's history, like you said, the Civil War is, I think, quite arguably the biggest crisis, right, since the founding of the country. And yes, the country does kind of come back together again, but then kind of also doesn't. And some of that progress was reversed and took decades to even begin to address. And we're debating right now, whether we adequately addressed it or if it doesn't need to be addressed or what have you. And I'm wondering, does it take a crisis of that magnitude to allow a country to even begin to heal its divisions? Right? Because now we see a very polarized country. We see a country that doesn't have a shared narrative about its past. And so to Joey's point, I would say we don't have a shared narrative about our descendants either. We don't know if we belong to the same country or community, if we feel each other as a people with a shared destiny. And I wonder then, based on what you've read and written, what do we need to find the kind of strength that a good number of people showed in that time?
Charles Sumner lived in a time when America literally unraveled. We talk about today the American fabric unraveling, but he lived in a time when it literally unraveled and Americans were literally killing each other. Nearly 700,000 people died, and he did not know what the future would look like. Now we can look back and the story kind of makes sense, but he lived in a time of deep uncertainty. His brother had died in the Civil War. He is seeing in 1862, he was afraid that Great Britain, the British Empire, would join the war by collaborating with the Confederacy, which, had that happened, we would not have the country we have today if the British Lion got involved in our conflict, right? And yet he continued to state, he once said, there are few who can stand firm like the oak tree against the storm. And we are living in turbulent times, but we have to stand firm like the oak tree. Part of that came from his own inner resolve and his own deep commitment to principle, which we can learn from now. It also came from faith. He was not much of a churchgoer, but he had a deep belief in God and God's active role in human history. He kept 2 Bibles by his bedside. And during the Civil War, battle after battle, Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, Atlanta, Vicksburg, all the slaughter that's happening around him. He compared that slaughter to the plagues of Egypt that the Egyptians were suffering until they allowed the Israelites their freedom. And so he said back then, we have more plagues to suffer until all will agree to let my people go. Prior to the Civil War, he is also connecting to God and to his faith when he continues to warn slaveholders on the Senate floor that as slavery is expanding westward, the country is going to destabilize, and slaveholders in their evil and in their recklessness will provoke an avenging God to bring about a fratricidal, parricidal war, the most cruel war in the annals of human history. He says something to that effect. So before the war, he is afraid that God will punish America with a civil war. The war actually happens, and during the war, he's afraid that there's going to be more plague and plague and plague. But he also believed that the promised land was coming, and that these were kind of necessary steps before the arrival of freedom for all. Which is scary in many ways if we compare that to today and think maybe God is punishing America for its failure to address these deep issues of racism and bigotry. And maybe we are going to suffer through some plagues. But we ought to have faith that if there is a God who may be doing these bad things, that God also has a plan for what is coming next. And that plan is a new spring.
We're excited to share a new sponsor. The Brueggemann Center for Dialogue at Xavier University, here in Cincinnati, is dedicated to deepening understanding across faiths and promoting systemic change. You can learn more about the Brueggemann Center and Xavier University in the show notes. Now, back to the conversation.
So I want to pick up on something you said. I mean, we haven't talked about your faith, and you're welcome to go wherever you want with this one. But we have an episode with Shadi Hamid, Washington Post columnist, and he talks about how he thinks the idea of hell is necessary. That there is a God of mercy and love. There's also a God of wrath and judgment, and that when God is only one of these things, right? Faith and society are imbalanced. I'm putting some words into his mouth, but that's kind of where I felt like he was going in that conversation. And this is something that certainly we hear from Lincoln, this idea that we're being punished for our sins, but that also takes a narrative. To have that position and to believe that requires that you believe that God is active in human history and that God does judge people and that people are found wanting and that sometimes God will create hardship in order to see if a person will arrive at the right conclusion, right? Or move in the right direction, shall we say. So I'm wondering, do you think that's true for you personally? Do you believe that kind of faith and that kind of religion is real or necessary? Because I think a lot of people, when they hear that, what you're saying about Sumner, what they hear sometimes in masjids at the mihrab and churches at the pulpit, can be deeply alienating and off-putting. But here you're also saying that sometimes maybe what we need, is that kind of proverbial divine kick in the pants. And it's a lot uglier than a kick in the pants, though, right? Like we're talking about a brutal conflict. So I wonder what you think of that idea of religion personally.
I think religion, among other things, teaches me two values. The first value is faith, as you describe. Not only faith, of course, in the afterlife, heaven and hell, God and prophets, but also faith that God is watching over us and that the story of humanity as it unfolds has divine supervision, which is what most early Americans believed. Deist, Presbyterian, Anglican, Unitarian, Jewish. There was a sense that America would be guided by God in both positive and negative directions, as I just described, based on how America was doing with its own, um, how America was coping with its own sins. And I think there's a lesson in there for us to both address those sins in our personal life and in the world around us, but also there's a lesson for us to have faith that someone else is in control. The second lesson is humility. And I really came across this in my research because I would spend 10, 12, 14 hours a day doing research. And people would always ask me, I would have a long day of writing and I'm with my roommates and they saw me at the table from 10 a.m. until 9 p.m. or more realistically from 9 p.m. to 10 a.m. overnight. Sometimes I would start working and in the evening and my roommate would go to sleep. His door was right next to my desk. And then he would wake up in the morning to go to work and I'm still there. He had a whole night's rest and I'm still there writing. And then he would ask me, well, how much did you write today? And I would say a sentence, maybe two sentences, a paragraph. And they would be so confused. How is that writing? And I'm trying to explain, well, most of writing is research and most of writing is reading. And most of what I'm doing is just reading as much as I can to find those morsels of truth, to figure out what happened, to pull those quotes. But as I'm doing that, as I'm digging deep, deep, deep and learning all this material, I'm mostly learning what I don't know and what I'll never know. I say this at the end of the book in the acknowledgments, that for every stone I overturned, there were 10 stones that I could not overturn. That for every one fact I learned, there's 10 facts that I was never able to learn. Like, for example, what did Columbus's translator say when he arrived? We may never know these things. And I think there was a lesson about the human frailty of knowledge. And we live in a time of AI where we think we can really learn everything, but we can't. Most of human information is gone, never to be retrievable by man. Classical Islamic scholars would always end their books by saying, Wallahu a'lam, and God knows better. Recognizing that no matter how smart you are and how good your book is, God knows better than you what really happened and what is really true. And so I end my book in the same way by recognizing the frailty of human knowledge.
Yeah,
No matter,
yeah, that's a great answer, Zaakir. I love that. I think I'm still stuck on this future orientation. Okay, so I'm gonna take you back to the future.
Back to the Future. Let's go.
Back to the Future. Yep. Michael J. Fox. Is that who it is? That is? Yeah.
I'm young to know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Joe, I'm a little concerned that you had to ask us that. I'm a little, from a
It
generational
is
perspective.
Michael J, right? Isn't it? Am I crazy?
Oh,
All right. Anyways,
God knows better.
Okay, yeah, Allahu alam. Okay, cool. So my question for you is, I have an assumption here that you're hoping to get into the legal field, kind of going forward with your occupation. Is that true? Is that a safe assumption?
Mhm.
Yeah, and it feels to me like it is, let's say, interesting moment to go into the legal field, with everything that's going on. The Supreme Court with these different law firms that seem to be bending to the will of certain inclinations, and we could go on and on. And I hear you talking about both your humility and also in a sort of faith of God interacting through history and through your life. I'm just wondering, how are you squaring all of that as you think about your own vocation and future?
One of the unexpected surprises in my research as I'm writing about Charles Sumner is that I learned a good deal about the founding of Howard University and specifically of Howard Law School, because Charles Sumner played a key role in creating Howard Law School. Howard Law School is the first law school in American history to not only be open to African Americans, but also to women. From day one, it was a law school for men, women, black, and white. So it's a multi-gender, multiracial legal academy. And Charles Sumner was invited to be the first commencement speaker at Howard Law School. He had already accepted an invitation to speak at Columbia, and he cancels on Columbia to speak at Howard. he arrives there, and what he tells the students is that he quotes from Cicero. Cicero said, "To be a good orator, you must be a good man." And he tells these students, these graduating students, to be a good lawyer, you must be a good man. And he calls on them to use their legal training to fight for justice, for their community, and for all communities. He spells it out in a way that someone could have written yesterday. This is really striking because in Sumner's era, lawyers did contracts, did property, wills and estates. That was the bread and butter of being a lawyer. Now everybody goes to law school and wants to be a civil rights lawyer, or at least that's what they say in their application before they get in, before they go into corporate law afterwards. But back then, it was an entirely new concept that he helped to invent. And I draw a lot from that because him in his own life, so Charles Sumner, he went to Harvard for law school. He was trained by Joseph Story, a titan of American law who sat on the American Supreme Court. He becomes a corporate lawyer in Boston after graduating. And then he uses that training to represent a 5-year-old black girl who wanted to go to a white-only school, and he collaborates with one of the first African-American lawyers in American history, effectively burning down his reputation to stand for justice. I'm not saying that I hope to burn down my reputation anytime soon. Maybe that day will come for the right cause in the right moment. But I think there's so much to learn from what he went through and what he taught other young students to go through, which is to take your learning, take your training, and use it to serve others. And I have this training, and I'm still trying to figure out what to do with it, but I hope it's in a way that Charles Sumner would be proud of.
You talk about Sumner, and you're talking about this idea, to be a great orator is to be a great man. I think that's quite beautiful, actually. Although I guess probably from lived experience, not always true, right? There's plenty of great orators who are not really great people.
Right.
Oftentimes the greatness of the oratory masks the insufficiency of the personality. But something that you touched on there about character and faith makes me want to pivot back to your faith, but not specifically belief, but your place within Muslim communities. And I don't mean that in the sense of, do you feel connected or not? Or, I mean, maybe you can go there if you want to, but more to the topic of, let me just say, we're a community in crisis as well. American Muslim communities are going through a pretty rough period around questions of freedom of speech, the war on Gaza, our place in the country, what's happening to international students. It is a very fraught time for American Muslims. Our eldest is going to college in the fall, inshallah. It's a weird time. I can imagine like what should be a cause for celebration and excitement about the next chapter in your life feels very different. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, I have a two-part question, but I'll start with this one, is how does it feel from where you are? I mean, you're not that far removed from UVA and Yale. You were there, obviously, for many years at two very prominent, mashallah, really great universities, at the heart of some really difficult conversations. What did it feel like to be an American Muslim? Because all I see as a parent and as a community member that's now far removed, you see a lot of conversations around faith and religion, identity, discrimination, DEI, all that stuff. I don't have any on the ground tangible conversations beyond, the anecdotal here and there. Is it like what it's described as in our mainstream conversations? Is it really hard to be an American Muslim on campus? You tell us.
There's a lot in our times that feels very uncertain and frightening. We are seeing people of all backgrounds, but including many Muslims, who have been literally picked up and disappeared, sent to El Salvador, sent to Louisiana, gross infringements on free speech, extremely racist, white supremacist rhetoric about who can be an American and who cannot be. And all of it reminds me of the 1850s. they were going through very similar times to today. And in some ways, we're reliving aspects of the 1850s. But I think it's helped me in some ways to know that history and helped me cope with what's going on now. Because we keep hearing this word that we are in an unprecedented crisis of free speech, of democracy, in immigration, that never before have we seen many of the challenges that we are seeing now. And that is not accurate. If we think today is bad, you should look at the 1850s. And so it's been odd for me because I'm both a participant in the current moment, but I'm also knowledgeable about previous moments that echo into what is going on today. So, for example, Charles Sumner in the early 1850s, he lives in a black neighborhood in Boston. And in that neighborhood, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, black Bostonians are terrified of being arrested or even just grabbed by a bounty hunter and deported to the South to be enslaved or re-enslaved under the pretense or accuracy that they were a fugitive from slavery. When a black person is arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act, a judge will decide whether they were always free or whether they are a fugitive from slavery, and the judge gets paid $5 for giving them freedom and $10 for sending them into slavery. That was written into the law. And the community is absolutely terrified of people getting arrested, and there's this mass migration of blacks out of Boston to Canada. And then there's a meeting of lawyers and activists under an umbrella organization called the Vigilance Committee that Charles Sumner helped to create, where they are deciding the next step for the black Boston community. And some black Bostonians and white Bostonians are saying they just need to all go to Canada where they will be safe. And Sumner responds and says, no, we have to stay here and fight. Almost literally, that's what he says. And they literally fought with gunpowder, with guns, to protect fugitives from slavery from being re-abducted and deported back to the South. And I think there's something to learn from that. I'm at Yale, where there have been, I think now, 3 professors, prominent Yale professors, who have opposed the rise of fascism, who speak out against anti-democratic threats, who have now moved to Canada and are giving these op-eds and being on interviews talking about how America is no longer safe and that's why they're going to Canada. And I'm wondering, what do the rest of us do? Because we're here and we're not going anywhere. And we have to stand for our communities here. And even as people are being deported, even as there are threats to free speech and democracy, we have to protect our communities. And we have to stand for what America can be in the future, rather than just run away from the problems.
Yeah, you're starting to get at this next question, but I just invite you to go a little bit deeper here. What I hear you saying is that you feel like there's some serendipity, some maybe plan behind you encountering these themes of the 1850s and Charles Sumner in this moment in our own history, in our lived history. I would love to hear, what is the invitation that you want to leave readers with as they encounter your book? And if I could just qualify it for one time, just a little bit here. What is the invitation for them individually within their specific neighborhoods and communities? Like, I'm very struck by this, by the point of action in that story is in that neighborhood in Boston. What's the invitation for our religious communities? I don't think that you're going to say take up arms, but feel free to go that way if you want to. But what is the invitation for us, though?
There's 2. The first is a call to solidarity. As I described, Sumner is so immersed in the struggle that he literally lives in a black neighborhood and is collaborating with black activists day in, day out to protect people from deportation. And I wish we do see some of it, but I wish we would see more of that solidarity in our own times, a recognition of shared struggle and the sharing of resources, the sharing of knowledge, the sharing of protection. The book is also a call to courage. Sumner lived in a time in 1856. His former colleague, a pro-slavery senator named David Atchison, goes back to his home state of Missouri and organizes a gang of more than 1,000 men to storm Kansas, which is a territory that is about to have an election on whether it's going to be a slave state or a free state. And they begin to take over polling locations at gunpoint to stuff the ballots to make sure that Kansas becomes a slave state. Atchison is a former U.S. Senator and also the former President pro tem of the Senate, now organizing an armed insurrection in a territory of the United States. And what is so striking is that in Washington, almost no one is talking about it. Very few northern anti-slavery senators have the courage to speak about the elephant in the room, that there is an organized pro-slavery takeover of American democracy taking place before their very eyes. Part of why they're so scared to speak is that they live in Washington, D.C., which is a slave city, where anti-slavery politicians are harassed on the street, are receiving death threats from the locals who are pro-slavery. And Sumner finds within himself the courage to call it out in one of the most famous speeches of American history, The Crime Against Kansas, where he lays out the anti-democratic insurrection being orchestrated by politicians in Kansas. He calls them out by name, and then he's assaulted afterwards and nearly killed. But it also, the caning of Charles Sumner, which happened after he gives a speech, galvanizes a movement, a pro-democracy movement that ultimately elects Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And as we live in times of democratic slippage, I wonder what it would take for our own leaders and our own communities, as you describe, to have that courage to speak out and to fight with the recognition that courage is a recipe to launching a pro-democracy movement.
So I want to carry that point in two directions. So the first is to Muslim communities, which I touched on in an earlier question, but I just want to ask you honestly, and I think I liked, Joey, the way you framed it about trying to make it tangible and relatable. So let's say, where are you right now, Zaakir?
Texas.
Texas, okay. Let's say, you're invited by the education committee at your local masjid, say, hey, mashallah, young man, published author, got a great resume. Clearly, you've accomplished great things. Teaching a bunch of high schoolers. We want you to design a course for them. Muslim students, different backgrounds, all of that. What would you teach? What would you want them to know in this moment or have in this moment that would set them up for what I think probably all three of us agree will likely be some pretty ugly, messy years ahead? That's the first question. I'll give the second one after.
I would teach them, both as I described, the tools and strategies that Charles Sumner and Black activists used in Boston. I would teach them about his courage and conviction. I would also teach, here's something I would teach. I would teach the story of Prince Ibrahim ibn Suri. He is an enslaved person in the South. whose father was the king of the Fulani people of West Africa. The Fulani being this major African tribe, a very prominent Sufi tribe to this day. Many prominent Muslim scholars, even today, went to West Africa to train under the Fulani people. Prince Ibrahim had been abducted at a young age, kidnapped, arrested, deported to the United States, and becomes enslaved, lives in the US for decades, and ultimately gets the Moroccan embassy in Washington to negotiate for his freedom. He comes to Boston when Charles Sumner is a young boy to raise money to purchase the freedom of his grandchildren. And what is striking about this moment is what he chooses to wear as he's fundraising for his grandkids. He dresses with a crimson sash, with a cape, and with a hat, a Turkish hat, a fez hat, that has a crescent on it. This is in like 1820s in Boston. And he is going to a black Masonic lodge. And he is telling them that we Africans have our own kingdoms, our own civilizations, our own languages, and our own religions that are indigenous to our place. And you can imagine the shock and surprise and the excitement in Black Boston for Black Bostonians to learn, usually for the first time, about Africa, a place that none of them had ever been to. And I think this story is so powerful, both because of his own struggle of escaping slavery, coming to freedom, and ultimately returning to Africa. But he is also unambiguous about his cultural heritage, wearing a Turkish fez hat with a crescent on it. And he is unambiguous about his commitment to American politics. It took a lot of lobbying to get Secretary of State Henry Clay to meet with the Moroccan embassy to negotiate his freedom. And today, we need a similar mix of our commitment to our own traditions, of our unabashedness in how we may dress or how we may speak, our love for our culture. And we also need to be unabashed about our commitment to being active, to being organizers, to being activists, lobbyists, politicians, to being immersed and steeped in the American tradition as Prince Ibrahim was. And if we are to get out of this crisis, we have to do both. We can't just be insular within our communities. We can't just, quote unquote, assimilate. We have to figure out how to do both things at the same time.
That's beautiful. And it brings me to the last question, which is going to start with a story that will feel very flippant, but underscores a deeper point. So I have a friend, likely Zaakir, you and I both have a friend, but since I don't have his permission to tell this story, I won't use his name. But he's a well-regarded Muslim writer and public figure. And he was at your alma mater, UVA, doing a talk. And a man approached him after his talk and asked him to sign for his signature. And the author, let's just call him the author. He says, "Well, what do you want me to sign?" Right? Because he didn't hand him a book or anything. And he said, "Well," the man said, I don't have anything for you to sign." So this kind of creates a little bit of a conundrum that I'm happy to sign something, but I need something to sign. And the man says, "Okay, I'll find something. I'll get right back to you." And so the author says, "Well, I have to get out of here in like 10 minutes. So you need to make it fast. I apologize, but I have a plane to catch in a few hours." So man comes running back 10 minutes later and he says, "All I could find was my Quran. Can you sign my Quran?" And the author says, "Absolutely not. I cannot sign a Quran. That's really weird, man." Right? And so he told me this story for the first time when I asked him what a book tour was like. Yeah. And he said to me, "You'll meet all kinds of people and you'll have some of the most memorable encounters of your life. And you have to decide for yourself, why are you there? Because it will be tiring. It will be grueling. People will be strange. They will make demands of you because they've read your book. They may think that they know you and they're your friend, even though you've never seen them before and likely will never see them again. long story short, I'm hearing a lot in this conversation about taking a stand, about principles, about courage, about democratic slippage. We're also hearing a lot nationally about how our country, may not be as divided as we think or needs to be stitched together. And those are all different things. And so I guess what I want to close with is I want to ask you, in this moment, through this book and the tour and your voice being out there and you becoming an American voice and an American Muslim voice, what do you want to get through to people, to your fellow Americans? Is it about taking a stand? Is it about bringing us together? Is there something that we're missing?
I think what's so great about American history is that no matter who you are or what background you come from, there's a lot you can draw from our shared hit past. Whether you're right wing, left wing, progressive, conservative, white, black, Asian, Muslim, Christian, we're all living the legacy of historical figures, whether we like them or not, and like that legacy or not. We've got to deal with it. So I like the fact that this book, I hope, can be a starting point for those conversations and bringing people together. I also think, I heard an author once say that writing a book is kind of like raising a baby who then becomes a child and then an adult on its own. In some ways, the book is no longer mine. Now that it's out, I can't control where it goes and what lessons someone takes from it. And I'm sure I'm going to meet someone at some book talk, I haven't yet, who's going to come up to me and be like, you got Charles Sumner all wrong. Here's why, point by point rebuttal, and blah, 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 blah. And I won't, and I may be like, yeah, maybe you're right. Like, look, like I wrote the book, but now it's yours. Like you bought it. You have just as much of a right to the story as I do. And it's a tricky balance because I once read this in high school. I read this in English class. We read this paper called Death of the Author. And I was so excited because it was the first time I was ever reading some kind of university level academic paper published in a journal. And it was short and it was a little hard to comprehend, but the title gave me enough to understand what was going on in the text of the paper, which was basically an argument that in literary analysis, you should never look at the author and their background to explain the book because the book no longer belongs to them. The book stands on its own. Now that I'm an author, I'm like, yes, Death of the Author all the way. Because I'm like, someone can ask me what goes on in this chapter of the book, and I'll be like, to be honest with you, I need a refresher. Like, can you pull it out for me? And then I can tell you what I recall. But if you just read it, you might know it better than I do. And so in some ways, yes, I have lessons to tell, but more importantly, people will draw what they want to draw from the book, and that's in some ways the joy of writing and giving something to the world.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Zach Swellbar for recording our theme music. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know what questions we should be asking and who else we should be talking to. For the next episode, we'll be speaking with Mohammed Marikar. We explore the meaning and implications of AI. Mohammed reflects on AI's rapid evolution from narrow tools to general-purpose systems while balancing optimism about efficiency with concern for lost human development and resiliency. We probe questions of education, faith, parenting, and morality, discussing how AI intersects with character formation, spiritual life, and societal structures. The conversation ultimately highlights both awe at AI's capabilities and anxiety about dependence, emphasizing the need for grounding in fundamental skills, moral frameworks, and embodied human experiences.